Hello, everybody. How are we? It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you all today. And I had that lovely moment. Sometimes it's not so good being towards the end of the day in terms of being a speaker. Sometimes it is. And where it's really nice is where you're listening to people talk. And over again, you're hearing this conjoining of messages and it starts to echo some of your thoughts. And I had this feeling of hope because of that, a feeling that there was a number of people in this room and in this space that were collectively ploughing our way through ways forward. And that was a really enjoyable experience to have. So thank you to all of the speakers already. So my name is Lynn Scarff. I'm director of the National Museum of Ireland. And the National Museum of Ireland is a national cultural institution. It will be 167 years old in 2 years' time. And I think many of my museum colleagues in this space will know what comes with being 167 years old. Usually very old buildings, quite a substantial collection. And while you have a lot of wonder and wonderful engagement and collections, you also have a lot of baggage. You have a lot of things that have built up over that time. And I suppose today, what I was interested in doing was talking about this idea of hope, particularly in the context of what that means as a national cultural institution and the situating of that in particular. So the National Museum of Ireland has 4 sites. It has collections similar to our colleagues from Bremen, archaeology, natural history. In our Collins Barracks Museum, it's arts and industry and design. And in Turlock Park, it's what we call our Folklife collection, so the Irish vernacular collection. And we're established by an act. We're under the aegis of our minister. And I think what's really interesting is that piece that we are always part of state and separate from state at the same time. And so we occupy this liminal space. And what I'm aware of is that in these recent years, that liminal space is getting tighter and tighter. And for many people in many museums and cultural spaces, they're navigating that on a day-to-day basis. And I'm interested in thinking about that and thinking about it in the context of what it means for contemporary practice in more historical cultural institutions. This is a very detailed slide that now that I look at it, think, what in God's name was I thinking putting this up? But just to sort of say, in 2021, we began the process in the museum of developing our new strategy. And we said, okay, let's look at what's happening around the world and let's see, what do we do? How do we respond to that? And I found this really useful at the time. It was from the Centre for Future Museums. I actually heard someone speak earlier on in the short pieces. But I mean, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but many of the future trends that were being discussed in those key themes: creativity, society, technology, economy, environment, politics. Keeping in mind that this was in 21 that they developed this, we're sort of in the middle of these right now, aren't we? I mean, many of them were, depending on where we are in the world, we're experiencing them acutely. And I suppose some of the questions today is, how do we as institutions respond to that? What is our relevance in this space? How can we demonstrate and deliver hope? So where we landed at the time of the development of our own strategy was that the National Museum would be a place of sanctuary and surprise. And in some ways, for me, this sort of echoes a little bit what Sharon was saying earlier on about grit and glitter. It sort of comes from a similar space. What it acknowledges for us in our institution is that we will always be the national cultural institution that you can walk in and see the Ardagh chalice or our treasures. They will be there, and we will continue. And we take that role of stewardship incredibly important. It's core to what we do. But we will also disrupt, and we will also surprise, and we will also do things that maybe you weren't expecting your national cultural institution to do. And what's been really interesting for me in the 3 years of that strategy was that when we first started talking about sanctuary and surprise, as you can imagine, anybody who leads an organization could feel in the room, I could feel people are going, what in the name of Lord is she on about, sanctuary and surprise? And within 3 years, people have started to use that term to explain and to situate their own work in it. And that was really important for us to find something that enabled our entire institution, from our conservators, who many of you will know have a very particular view of how we go about exhibiting and opening out our collections, to our learning teams, to our marketing teams. And I think that kind of concept that of essentially that we've built inclusivity into the overall statement. So we're not saying this way good, this way bad. We're saying there's place and space for everything here. And that's what we want to develop. And so we talked a lot about what a national museum is and where it sits. And so where we have situated ourselves is between these 3 points. What makes us unique, we feel, is that we occupy this central space in this triangle between conversation, authenticity, and time. And I saw time come up as well as a theme elsewhere, but that idea that you give us your time, but that also there's this idea of moments, continuity, change, and how we represent that kind of that through the collection, and how that can be reinterpreted depending on who you're bringing into that conversation. But that fundamentally what we hold is the real objects, the objects that bore witness to moments in time, be it, a cup, a flag, a dress. And that by bringing people into a conversation with those objects, there's an immediate connection and authenticity to that is unique to a collection-based organization. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about some projects that for me have epitomized this kind of way of working and this process of change that has been going on within our organization. So the first one there, this is what's called a BD pocket. And a BD pocket is a very important object to traveller women in Ireland. And travellers are an ethnic minority in Ireland that our government at the time of the 1950s effectively tried to wipe them out. They were a nomadic people. They stopped them from moving around the country. Many of them were taken from their families and put into institutions. And as a result, much of their cultural heritage was absolutely underrepresented within our national cultural institution. But also what was represented was a very white, male, Eurocentric view of this community. And so 4 years ago, we brought in a new curator, Owen de Vardoon, and we developed a whole new strand of curation within our museum called Inclusive Histories Curators. And Owen was the first of our Inclusive Histories Curators. And Owen, first of all, went and looked at the collection to see what did we have from the traveller community. And what we had was really only representations of their economic activity, so tinsmithing. We had nothing that really represented their cultural, spiritual heritage as such. And he started working with communities. And what emerged was that in many ways, many traveller communities wanted to have objects within the National Museum, but they didn't want to part with those objects. And so began a whole new process for us as a national cultural institution of how do you acquire objects into your collection that are never going to be in your building? And what does that look like for your conservation team and for your curators? And how does that work? And how do you ensure that that object has the same weighting as the Ardagh chalice that's sitting in our treasury in the Kildare room? And so we started to develop new acquisition policies as a result of Owen's work. And Owen's work continues, working with a whole variety of different communities. Another project that we did was a project called, a specific aspect of it, Remember to Forget the Past. The National Museum of Ireland was established when Ireland was still part of Empire. And so a lot of the material that we have within the National Museum would have come from South Kensington originally. So we had an object we have a collection of about 20,000 objects that for up until about 8 years ago was termed our ethnographic collection. It's now our world cultures collection. But when Ireland emerged as a free state in the 1920s, that collection was effectively put to one side, and a report was carried out at the time that said focus on Irish archaeology and Irish ethnography. And so it was really put in a press and forgotten about. Some of it was displayed until the 60s, but in the most part, that collection has not had a curator ever in its entire existence. And so 3 years ago, we brought in a new curator for that collection who started to look through the objects. And it's an incredible collection with many objects from Africa, from Oceania, from Australia, but that had never been documented, really, had never been in many ways communicated to the outside world what was in that collection. And so we opened the doors and we started to do work, and we started to invite communities into the museum to look at these objects with us, and to tell us their stories and their understanding of these objects. And as part of that, we had an artist in residency program where it's an artist, Anthony Haughey. And one of the pieces that he developed was a project called Remember to Forget the Past, where 3 women originally from Sudan, South Africa and Nigeria explored how 19th and 20th century colonialism had shaped their lives and continued to shape their lives as women, as Irish citizens living in Ireland. And this is Lena, and she spoke about spoke about particular collections from Sudan, and Loretta was from South Africa. And I always remember this particular quote from Loretta, which was, I think museums are mournful places. It's like visiting a cemetery or the ruins of an imperial past where histories and memories collide, but like the phoenix rising from the ashes, it is also a place full of exciting possibilities where we can reimagine and reclaim our own histories. And so projects like this for us have begun to shape how we go about the exhibiting of these collections in a very, which is fundamentally based in a co-curatorial process. So where communities are coming in, selecting objects, and then working with us on the exhibition and display of those. And that has produced interesting points, because in many times, both with our traveller collections and with these collections, people have come and communities have come and said, so to give you an example with the traveller collection, Owen saw a tin cup and said, oh, I know the man who made that cup. I'll go and talk to him. And he went to talk to him, and the guy said, yeah, I did make that cup. And Owen said, it's not one of your best pieces of work. And he said, why would I have given my best piece of work to the museum? And of course he said that. Why would he say anything different? And also a lot of the kind of documentation when we started to look through our files was wildly incorrect. Things were being named things that they weren't, and so on. So this has been an exciting and engaging piece of work for us that we're only really at the beginning of the journey on. I also wanted to talk then about Changing Ireland. So Changing Ireland was an opportunity that arose for us in the National Museum of Ireland. Sorry, I'll go backward. To expand our galleries. So it was the greatest expansion of our public galleries in 2 decades. And we have a significant collection of 20th and 21st century collections that we hadn't put on display for a very long time. And when we were first funded for this project, there was a sort of notion that it would be a chronological history of the last 150 years of Irish history. And of course, as soon as we actually sat down to do that, we said, this is impossible and frankly bonkers. This is not going to work. And so leaning into this idea of sanctuary and surprise, we started to think about this collection as being objects of particular moments in time and what those objects could tell us. So there's a loose chronology, but really the idea of the exhibition is that it's exploring this period of time, but with the capacity for us to be able to move and change out objects quite rapidly, and also that a significant part of it particularly the more difficult histories, were co-curated with communities, with people with lived experience of that part of our history. And so a lot of the kind of background to it was this question of, what is Ireland to you? What does it mean to you? And inviting people in to talk to us about their own experience of Ireland, be it good, bad, indifferent in some ways, and then thinking about the objects that we have in our collection to explore that. And that was everything from the first Gaelic typewriter to an orange order sash beside a banner for the Irish Women's Franchise League, to Panty Bliss's dress, who is a gay rights activist in Ireland, to a paramilitary jacket, to a repeal jumper from a recent referendum in Ireland, to a cooker that was when rural electrification happened, to a object that was discovered during an archaeological dig on a motorway in Cork, which is the very first known representation of the human face in Ireland. It's over 5,000 years old. To the yellow bunting, which is a species which is now extinct. So what we were trying to do in the process of Changing Ireland was to bring these objects into conversation with our visitors. But a big part of the work as well was a co-curation work, and that was working with individuals and communities, particularly from survivor communities in Ireland of institutional abuse. This is a gateway on Railway Street, which is beside Sean McDermott Street. And recently, the National Museum of Ireland has been tasked by government to develop a national centre for research and remembrance. Some of you may know or may not know that Ireland has a significant history of institutions of historic abuse that range from what we would have called Magdalene laundries, where young pregnant women were sent to mother and baby homes, to industrial schools, to county homes. At one point in the 1950s, about 1% of the Irish population was in one of these institutions, and they were sites of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. And in recent years, there has been a government apology. There's also been an action plan. And one of the plans that came out of that was the development of this centre. And what's at the heart of it is two elements. One is that for many people who are survivors or affected people of these institutions, they have been unable to access any of their records because those records have been kept or hidden by religious institutions or destroyed, or in the case of state bodies, they haven't been released. And so our National Archives is taking the job of new legislation recently preventing the destruction of archives, but they are also taking all of these records into this centre. So it will have all records from all of these institutions. And then the museum is working on the interpretive element of that space. So we're collaborating. The first time two national cultural institutions in Ireland have occupied a building together. So even that in itself is kind of groundbreaking. But the site itself is in the northeast inner city of Dublin. And it will also have a new third level facility, new social housing, an early learning site. But the core of it is the National Centre. And at the core of that work, sorry, just to return to this slide, is that all of the exhibits, all of the interpretation will be developed by the museum through a co-curatorial process with survivors. And so in the last 2 weeks, we've established a lived experience expert panel, which is a panel of people who will be working with us on the development of all of the interpretive materials. And as part of Changing Ireland, we did a first iteration of what that co-curation process looks like and how it works. And we continue to work with communities in developing that further as we plan for the project going forward. And so in the context of all of this work, I suppose I wanted to share today some of the things that we've learned as we move from that space of being a historic national cultural institution with all of the weight and baggage that comes with that, and wonderful things as well, let's be honest. But in terms of the kind of contemporary practice that we do, it can be more difficult for institutions sometimes of that scale and legacy. And thinking about what have we learned with the projects that we're working on, and what can we take forward. And I suppose I offer this as much as a conversation point for us all over the next few days. I think people have many experiences to add to this, or maybe they disagree or agree. So I suppose from the point of view of a director, everything needs to be on the table and open for change. And that can be hard in an institution of scale, but I spoke about how our acquisition policies have changed, how systems have changed, staff roles have changed, the way that people work. And that has been challenging for staff in some contexts. Some staff have jumped at the opportunity, other staff have found it difficult. And that's been a process as well for the institution to work through. Doing helps with seeing. So for 2 years, our director of collections and a number of the team were speaking about changing Ireland, and people kept saying, what, you mean there's no really big, long text panel explaining the historic context? And we said, no, there's no text panel. There's just something that tells you what it is. And so it can be hard for people to grapple and grasp with that and to imagine that change if they can't see it. And so Changing Ireland and these projects that we've been working on have given people an opportunity to actually visualize what it is that you mean when you're talking about this kind of work. The pursuit of opportunity. We find again and again that innovation in our museum occurs when we make space for teams to follow opportunities, and that requires letting go of a certain level of hierarchy within your organization, and that can be difficult for organizations that are fundamentally built on a hierarchical system and have existed working along those lines. And that means you have to have an increased appetite for risk, that what the work that you're doing may be perceived differently, incorrectly. And that you have to have leadership that provides the space and the cover for that work. So in other words, there's an element of trusting your teams to do work and then covering if it doesn't go the way that everyone had hoped or planned. This is probably the most important one, the idea of moving at the pace of trust. I know this was the theme in 2024, but I think it's a really important thing to think about. It's not just that we are trusted in institutions, but the idea of what does moving at the pace of trust mean? These are all projects and work that is done in a relational context, and that requires time to build those relationships. And it's a recognition that you hit bumps, but that values of transparency, genuine engagement and empathy are crucial to it. And then what a lot of speakers mentioned today, to do, reflect and do again, that you need to build in time for reflection as the work progresses, not at the end. And that you need to have support mechanisms. I think Sandra mentioned that earlier on. A lot of our staff now are trained in trauma-based practice. We have ongoing supervision support for a lot of our teams that are doing this work. And that's there for them to avail of as and how they wish. But the important thing for the organisation is that it's there and it's serving our teams as they take on this process and this work. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for this overview. No, please don't go. Maybe we have questions for Lynn. Any questions? Here's Elena.
Hi, I just want to, it's very interesting, congratulations, the concept about combining your museum with changing Ireland. And I want to ask something about the Magdalen laundries. If I understood correctly, the National Museums came together and you have a space where you document oral histories as well. This is my question. I mean, instead, you have only the archives that are available, or you have created a space where people can come and share oral histories as survivors, but also as second generation trying to find their own path through this trauma.
Thank you. It's great when people ask a question about something I entirely forgot to say. So Thank you very much. So, yes, what we're beginning to do is to build oral histories with survivors and affected people. And the approach that we've taken is that many people come to the museum with objects. So they come with a variety, and we take them through a process where they talk about what this object means to them. And so they take us through their own experience, but in the context of looking at the object and what the object for them in terms of their own life experience represents. And we find that is a very engaged but heartening process for people involved, because I think somebody mentioned earlier on that sometimes when you're doing this work, you forget that there's also joy and humor in the work. And we found that rather than going directly into an oral history space and asking people almost in an oral testimony context, instead our work begins with the object, and that for many people can help them as they tell their lived experience. Many other aspects of their lives come into play in that. So yes, in the Magdalen, in Sean McDermott Street, which is a former Magdalen laundry, we will have a mixture of oral histories and objects, and people's lived experience will be a core part of that. Yeah. And I should just say that tomorrow, the masterclass, I'll be speaking specifically about that work and what we've been doing, if people are particularly interested.
Great. Could I ask something as well regarding changing Ireland? Is it like a project, a work, a long-term project that you do as National Museum of Ireland only, or are you planning or thinking or collaborating with other museums around the country too?
Yeah, it's a really good. So, as the national cultural institution, as the National Museum, we have a role to designate in Ireland what we call our local museums. So we have 14 different local museums around the country, and we have an aim, which is that nobody in Ireland should be less than 20 minutes from their national collection, and that happens through our local museums. They can take any of the national collection on loan, and we work with them in that process. So the concept of Changing Ireland is exactly that. We just opened it in October, but the thinking is that objects will move. Some objects people are particularly keen to have early on. Other objects people are collecting within their own local community. And it's supported by a further project that we have called ICANN, which is a community archive network that works with hyper-local communities. So people living on one street who are maybe digitizing a collection from that one street, and that feeds up into that system as well. So in as many kind of places and ways as possible, we're trying to develop a kind of co-curatorial process that then has somewhere to live within the overall national cultural institutions.
It's quite a multi-collaborative project.
Yeah.
And thank you. Thank you, Lynn, so much for that.